Hello, and welcome to the second of the ATC Basics lessons. This lesson will cover how to read most of the resources available to controllers, including various charts and strips. Before we learn how to read the chart though, let's learn what the different charts are actually depicting. First off is a procedure called a Standard Instrument Departure, more commonly abbreviated as a SID. A SID is a charted departure route or procedure that IFR aircraft use to help in organizing the flow of departure traffic. The SID can tell pilot what headings to fly, what waypoints to fly to, and what altitudes and speeds to fly at. Every SID contains another important concept you'll need to know, a transition waypoint. For SIDs, the transition waypoint is where an aircraft exits the SID and continues on the rest of their filed route. In other words, it is where they transition from the SID to the rest of their filed route. You can also think of it simply as the last waypoint on the SID that the aircraft will fly to before continuing onwards, whichever is easier for you. The next charted procedure we'll learn about is the Standard Terminal Arrival Route, commonly abbreviated as STAR. A STAR is a charted arrival route for IFR aircraft that helps in organizing the flow of arriving traffic from wherever they're coming from towards their final approach to the runway. In many ways, you can think of STARs as the opposite of SIDs, or SIDs but for arrivals. The components of a STAR are the same, telling the pilot what heading or waypoints to fly to, and at what altitudes or speeds. However, instead of ending with a transition waypoint, STARs begin with the transition waypoint. For STARs, the transition waypoint is where the aircraft enters the STAR, transitioning from their filed route onto the STAR. Again, if it is easier, you can think of it as the aircraft's first waypoint in the STAR. While it is necessary to know what a STAR is, you won't have to deal with them as much as a delivery controller, so we will only learn how to read the SID charts. That said, they are very similar, so you may be able to read both with ease after this lesson. So, what's in a SID chart? As for the important stuff, you'll see the airport name, relevant frequencies, remember that director is equivalent to approach and departure, and the SID name. Below the SID name are also the departure runways that the SID can be used with. The Xerxes 2 departure can be used when aircraft depart runway 27 left or runway 27 right, but not when aircraft departs either of the runway 09s. The bulk of the chart is the visual depiction of how the SID should be flown, additionally showing any altitude or speed restrictions, such as the maximum speed of 210 knots at Xerxes, which should be crossed at 3,000 feet. Each of the 4 pointed stars represents a waypoint. The giant red circle, labeled Tofan VOR 10 km, is the minimum safe altitude, or MSA, for the area around the Tofan Bridge Airport. If you are flying towards the airport from the south, for example, you should maintain at least 1,700 feet to be clear of any obstructions. On the other hand, if you are flying inbound towards Tofan between the headings 020 and 080 from the northeast, you should maintain at least 2,400 feet to clear some higher obstructions or terrain in the area. We talked about transition waypoints, and for each SID, they are identifiable by the waypoint names in parentheses. Aircraft flying the Xerxes 2 departure on the Aleppi transition would follow dotted arrows labeled with the Xerxes 2.Aleppi in parentheses. For this SID, the valid transitions would be Aleppi, Heckler, and Onae. At the bottom of the chart is the text briefing for the SID. The valid departure runways are again listed here, along with the text instructions for flying the SID. With SIDs and STARs out of the way, let's broaden our scope to look at airspace. Different airspace classes define how airspace is controlled and the requirements for flying in that area. For anyone curious, the structure of our airspace somewhat reflects the United States or FAA's airspace structure. In this lesson, we will learn about the Class Bravo and Class Charlie airspaces, which surround the airports in flight line. Class Bravo airspace is the airspace surrounding the busiest airports. In flight line, only Tofan Bridge is a Class Bravo airport. Since it is the busiest, it is also the most restrictive, and requires a specific clearance for all aircraft, though you'll learn what that means later. Class Bravo airspaces are specifically shaped to fit the airport's needs and are especially restrictive for VFR aircraft, which you will again see what that means in a later lesson. Class Charlie airspace surrounds the airports that are busy enough to have a tower and radar approach control, but not busy enough to be deemed a Class Bravo. In flight line, these are the Royal de la Rue and Willenhall Square airports. Class Charlie airspace is less restrictive, simply requiring that the pilot communicates with ATC before entering the airspace, but the radar controller will still provide separation services. Airspaces can be a quite abstract concept, but for now, it's more important to know that these distinctions of airspace classes exist than to know the details of what each class entails. So please don't worry about these details, but feel free to ask any questions if you have them. With that out of the way, how can you tell where the airspaces actually are? That's one of the reasons we have the en route chart, or ERC. The most important thing to note on this chart is that north is on the left of the map, east is on the top, south is to the right, and west is on the bottom. Keep that in mind when comparing to the scope in-game or when using the map for navigational purposes. Back to the topic of airspace classes, Class Bravo airspace is outlined in a solid blue line, while Class Charlie airspace is depicted in a dashed blue line. Here you can see the TOEFL Class Bravo airspace, and to the southeast of that is the more circular, well-installed Class Charlie airspace. Airports themselves are depicted by green circles with 4 stubs on each side. The last topic for this lesson is the flight progress strip. These strips give controllers all the information that we need about an aircraft and also allows us to make annotations to pass along information to other controllers. We'll start from the top left of the strip, where you can find the call sign. Just below that is the aircraft type. Some aircraft types will be preceded by an H/, which indicates that the aircraft is in the heavy weight class. This doesn't really affect anything in flight line, so you can ignore it. Similarly, the slant L at the end of the aircraft type usually represents what navigation equipment an aircraft has, but in flightline, this doesn't really matter. Lastly, on the left column is the computer ID number, or CID. This number is simply to help the computer handle the strips, so it doesn't affect the controller. Moving to the next column is the squawk code that is to be assigned to the aircraft. Then you had the time that the flight plan was filed in Zulu time, or GMT-0. In the real world, this is actually the proposed departure time, hence the P, but in flightline, this doesn't matter. The bottom box is the pilot's requested cruise altitude as a flight level, or in hundreds of feet. If you remember from the last lesson, flight level 100 is equivalent to 10,000 feet, and is also where we start calling the altitudes flight levels. In the next column, you'll find the origin and destination airports, followed by the pilot's filed flight rules. The bottommost box, with the different font, is the assigned departure runway. This will be typed by the ground controller once taxi instructions have been given. The largest of these boxes shows the filed route, and below that is the remarks. Both are editable by controllers, however, only amend or change the route if you have the pilot's consent. Lastly, on the right of the strip is a 3x3 grid. These are used by controllers for various annotations, and in flightline, we'll use the top left and middle left boxes. The top left box is where the controller would type the ATIS letter reported by the pilot, and the middle left box can be clicked to add a check mark indicating that the aircraft has been given its clearance. There's a lot of information to unpack on the strips, but it's pretty easy to figure out what the call sign and route are, for example. Make sure to give special attention to the squawk and requested cruise altitude so that you don't mix them up. That's all for this lesson. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. Remember to go at your own pace in order to not overwhelm yourself, and with that, we'll see you on the scopes.